He told her one sentence that rearranged the floor beneath her feet. "You're Barren." The words landed in the penthouse like a throne, glass clear, cold, and impossible to recover. They cut through the murmur of their life. The breakfast ritual, the quiet nights with city lights pricking the windows, the soft promises that had once been enough. She remembered exactly where she was when he said it on the marble by the kitchen island, one hand on the vein of a fresh-cut orange, the other clutching the corner of a silk scarf she'd braided into her hair that morning. The color left her face in a way it had not when the papers were signed. Michael did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence was a verdict, and he delivered it like a judge who'd already closed the file. Memory does odd things. It archives the wrong details. She could tell you the pattern on the throw pillow in the bedroom, the exact way a sliver of light caught Michael's watch, the smell of the coffee machine left half-brewed on the counter. What she could never quite reclaim was the heat of shame pooling under her skin, the way her hands trembled not from anger but from the sudden, foreign feeling of being unloved for a thing she could not prove wrong in that hour. They married with photographs that smelled faintly of jasmine and promises. He was diplomatic and tidy. She was loud with laughter and habitually kind. Friends said they balanced each other. The first year had been a slow bloom of small rituals. She learned the name of his father's whiskey. He learned how to braid her hair. But marriages have economies, some debts in affection that compound faster than warmth. Michael's withdrawal came as quiet dinners migrated to later nights. Text messages went longer between. He began to stand at the window and not come back for hours. When she asked, he said work. When she pressed, he would smile the efficient smile of someone solving a problem he believed was not her burden. Then one night, when the gulf between them had become visible in the way forks went unused, he said it in a voice without tremor. There was no anger to feed, just a calm cruelty that felt like a decision. "You Barren?" The word was casual, like a weather report. It left her with the next decision: to stay and argue, or to get up and leave while he chose. There is a lightness to some acts of leaving, like stepping off a curb into a street you know will not swallow you. She chose the curb. She packed what could not be replaced: a set of prints by an artist who painted city skylines, the braids she'd worn since she was a girl, a wooden spoon her grandmother had given her for luck, the rusty sweaters, the framed diplomas. The watch stayed behind in the penthouse that had turned overnight into Michael's museum. Imani lived on the third floor of a walk-up that smelled like stew and old paperback novels. Her apartment was small and loud in the best way. A couch with cushions in oranges and greens, a plant that refused to die because Imani refused to let it, and a window that looked directly onto the narrow street where everything in the neighborhood happened. When Zenobze, to everyone who loved her, arrived with 2 suitcases and a silence she could not quite put down, Imani handed her a bowl of steaming pepper soup and told her, without flinching, to cry on the cushions until her cheeks fell back into place. "You don't owe him your silence," Imani said, stirring the soup. "You owe yourself the truth of your body. We'll find it. We'll make them eat those words, one test at a time. Tests have the peculiar power to reorder guilt. Medical rooms are bland and not meant to comfort." Dr. Patel's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and citrus, a contradiction to the minute panic that lived in Zanob's chest. The doctor was precise and steady, hands like a clocksmith, eyes that made you feel seen rather than judged. The fertility clinic was clinical in every sense. Soft chairs, muted magazines, the low hum of machines that did not care about marriages or marriage's end. "There are many reasons couples face difficulty," Dr. Patel said as she scanned the files. "Sometimes it's male factor. Sometimes age. Sometimes, after repeated cycles, we find no simple answer. Testing is the only way to know." Zenob listened to the list of possibilities with a held-breath focus. She agreed to the full panel because anger had turned to a determination that would not be shaken by the calming tone of a specialist. Blood work, ovarian reserve scans, semen analysis, words that could either clear her name or scatter it further. The weeks that followed felt like living in a small, brightly lit room where every hour presented its own paper to fold, stamp, and place under a door. When the results came, Dr. Patel's voice did the delicate work of telling her the world was not as Michael had declared it. "Your tests show you are fertile, she said. Your ovaries are responding well. There's no evidence of diminished reserve. That does not explain everything. Male factor infertility is a common, often overlooked cause. But you, Zay, are not the failure here. The relief that rushed through Zainab was not a sudden fireworks display. It was a slow, irrevocable thaw. She cried in Dr. Patel's office, not the racking, accusatory kind of cry, but the kind that loosens a knot in the throat. Afterwards, in Imani's living room, they sat with cold tea and the perfect, ridiculous feeling of someone who has been granted back a piece of themselves without fanfare. Vindication is a quiet thing at first. It builds like a basement foundation. She returned to work at the gallery with a gait that felt steadier. The gallery had become her place of reconnection to life, curating shows of artists who painted things that hurt and then healed, choosing frames like one chooses companions. There was a freedom in hanging art lines, making sense in a way people around her had not been able to. She began to braid her hair in the mornings again, long, thick plaits that caught the sun and made her feel ancestral and new at once. She rebuilt with small, stubborn rituals. She learned to say no to invitations that felt like tests of endurance. She reconnected with cousins who called to remind her that family was more than a marriage certificate. She posted a few pictures online, not to boast, but to plant a flag that she still existed in the world as someone with color and desire. The comments were the usual mix of kindness and strangers' opinions. Most days she let them be background noise. At the gallery opening of a show, featuring a photographer who captured city faces in blue light, she first saw Deng. He stood across a room of people, talking in polite half-sing, a sleeve of silk at his wrist catching the low gallery lamps like a private moon. He was not the kind of man to scowl or to laugh loudly. He listened. He had the patient calm of someone who knew how to wait. Around him, a subtle geometry, arranged two men who stayed slightly behind him. A woman who moved with the fluid certainty of someone who could handle a crisis before it arrived. But the moment he stepped closer to the photographs, he did not seem like a threat. He seemed like a person who had been listening to the shapes of other people's stories and had come to the show to learn another. When their eyes met, it was not cinematic in the way movies pretend. There was a quiet recognition someone had looked at a face and, in one measured glance, catalogued not a threat, but a potential companion. He introduced himself as Kong Dung. He spoke with a slight reserve, a voice softened by attention the way someone chooses words that won't bruise. I like the way the photographer catches the city at night, he said, nodding toward a print where neon smeared like watercolor. There's honesty in how the light misses some things. Zainab found herself surprised at how easily she answered. Conversation, she realized, had become a scarce commodity after years of marital silences. With Deng, words came back like breath into a room forgotten. They talked about the exhibit, about the artist's choice to place faces in shadow, about how light erases and reveals. He listened to her in a way Michael had stopped doing, not because Michael didn't care, but because Michael had learned to make his attention finite and rationed. Diang's attention felt generous, like an offered hand in a crowded place. He did not volunteer his past. There was, in his profile, an implicit depth, an impression of doors closed, not by force, but by necessity. He answered questions with enough to satisfy curiosity without laying out his history on a table for inspection. When the city's lights came through the gallery windows and painted their faces in a softer hue, she felt something fold inward that had been raw and exposed. The world that Deng moved through, attached to him like a shadow, respectful distance, quiet security, a readiness for disruption. The gallery's staff whispered about the new patron with curiosity, then with an automatic caution. In a neighborhood where gossip could travel faster than an Uber, when the man who kept his counsel began to frequent the showings, people noticed. But few of them guessed the tenderness that premiered in small, private spaces. Deng opened doors for her, not the ostentatious kind, but the ones that held steady when storms tried to push in. He asked about her work, her family, the braids she did every Sunday, because they were a ritual learned from her mother. One evening, after a quiet dinner where they had tasted kimchi and jollof rice from neighboring stalls, the modest way a city offers two cultures to one table, he said, in a voice careful as a confession, I have certain responsibilities, People will make narratives about them with or without me. What matters is who you are and what you choose. She understood his meaning. There was a hint of danger in that admission, like the soft scrape of a blade being tested on stone. But there was also humility. He did not wear his power like a costume. He carried it the way someone would carry a heavy book, with respect for its weight and with an understanding that others might not be able to bear it. The intimacy between them grew slowly and without spectacle. They went to small concerts, to late-night restaurants that smelled of spice and citrus, and to corners of the city where lights pooled like spilled coin. He met Imani at a brunch once, and the two of them, sitting side by side, shared a joke that loosened something in her chest. Deng watched her sleep once, and later told her, quietly, that he liked the way her face relaxed when it surrendered to rest. She told him about the therapy sessions, about the tiny, persistent grief that claimed afternoons sometimes. He offered steadiness without trying to fix her. He offered presence. When a test at the Clinican appointment she had scheduled with an awkward, private kind of cutter showed a faint line on the early strip, her hands shook as if from cold. The precision of the scanner made paper into revelation. She went to have the blood draw for confirmation alone at first, because even when she wanted a companion, some moments have to be held privately. The nurse's professionalism was a small sort of comfort. The clinical beep of the machine was less a threat than it had been the night Michael spoke. Deng was the man she called when the second confirmation came. 2 heartbeats. A small cluster of movement impossible to mistake. 2 dark points on a screen like a map to a new life. The way he took the news was both gentle and resolute. There was a steadiness in the way he placed his hands over hers, as if both a shelter and a promise. "This changes things," he said, the words crisp, yet unafraid. "It changes everything," she answered, joy and terror braided together in her ribs. She thought, for a moment, of the penthouse, of Michael standing at that island as if the world could be made precise by words. She thought of Dr. Patel's calm face and of Imani, who had sat in the kitchen and said, simply, "We will feed these babies well." The pregnancy held a complicated joy. It was, at once, vindication and a new responsibility. She remembered how, after the clinic appointment, she had walked in the rain and felt the city wash her like a ritual. It was not the simple happy ending of a movie. It was a decision to build a life with someone who carried shadowed parts but who had offered her light where she needed it. Deng did not parade the news. He held it like a small, bright thing he would not allow to be broken. The first ultrasound was a hesitant, miraculous thing. The technician's voice was calm, her hands deft. There were 2 tiny shapes, each with its own heartbeat that sounded like the ping of an answering machine for the soul. Zainab's chest opened and closed in amazement. She repeated the word in her head like a litany. 2 little lives held in a space that had once been claimed as absence. She thought of Michael and the cruelty that had once been flung like a spear. The thought did not crown her with triumph. Instead it lent the edges of her joy a somber relief. She had been declared lacking, and now 2 lives grew with the undeniable evidence of their presence. Word moved like honey and like fire. Deng, careful as he was, understood the implications. He met with doctors, with nurses, and with the social rituals required of a man who had to move public and private spheres at once. He asked appropriate questions about prenatal care. He did not offer solutions to the past. He offered scaffolding for the practical help with finding a stroller that fit in a city car, a quiet conversation about names and where children should learn the shape of home. Their life became a choreography of small safeguards. Deng's associates were not explained. He never offered a primer. There were men who arrived when needed to pick up groceries, who left when the lights went down. There were whispers in the world outside, rumors of his capacity, the sorts of things that make tabloids salivate. He never encouraged those whispers. He did not deny them emphatically either. He existed in the gray, between headlines and truth, and in that gray he sheltered her with a devotion that was both frightening and tender. When the invitation arrived, it landed in her mailbox like a folded challenge. Michael had sent 1 white, heavy stock, embossed with his name and that of a woman named Victoria Hayes. The ink sat cool against the paper, the kind of script that promised marble, crystal, champagne. The first time she held it, she felt no urge to respond. It was a small, absurd thing. This little piece of paper asking for her physical presence at the very spectacle he would make of his happiness. She sat at Imani's table and turned the card over in her hands as if it were fragile. "Do you think this is to shame you?" Imani asked, scratching at a postcard pinned to the fridge. "It could be," Zainab said. She thought of the penthouse kitchen, of the silk scarf, of the casual sentence that had become a story told at parties. She thought, too, of the quiet facts of her life, the heartbeat on the screen, Diong's steady hands, the gallery's new show that opened in 2 weeks. The invitation felt like an old wound being prodded to see whether it still bled. Beneath the decision was another, louder, pulsing opportunity to reclaim the narrative, to show up uncloaked by the shame they'd tried to pin on her, to let the world see that a woman they had catalogued as lacking was, instead, on the cusp of making a family. "Go," Imani said finally, as if she was speaking on behalf of every friend who had sat with Zainab through the slow hours of reclaiming. "Not for him. Not for show. Go because you decide how your story ends." There was a practical center to the choice. To attend would be to step into a room that had once been his, with the evidence of life on her body. To not attend would be to let him keep the frame. She thought of the simple mechanics of it. A dress that made her feel like herself, not a costume, a plan for arrival and exit that did not ask for drama but refused humiliation, a consideration of the children inside her that made her want to shield them from petty cruelty while still teaching them the taste of dignity. She did not tell Michael she would come. He had expected humiliation, a spectacle. He had a color in his head for how this would look, her small and ashamed, Imani in the back row nervously fanning herself. He did not know they'd be getting a different light. Before the night of the wedding, life moved in small, conspiring joys. There were night markets where she and Deng bought a lamp that cast a soft amber across their kitchen table. There were long walks in parks where babies toddled with parents who laughed like weather changing. There were fittings where a dress was adjusted so that it would contain breath and pride without asking for attention it did not need. She practiced saying the words that might be asked. "Congratulations. I wish you both the best." She practiced letting the same words curl into a different tone if anyone tried to use them as a barb. Imani insisted on braiding her hair in a particular way the morning of the event, a style that had been worn by their aunt at so many weddings that the pattern felt protective. They both laughed at the small superstitions that anchored them. A coin for luck stitched into a hem, the scent of grandma's perfume dabbed at the wrist. It was not a plan for revenge. It was a plan for presence. One late evening, Deng and Zainab stood by the window of their apartment that looked down at the river. The city light made 1,000 small mirrors of the water. He turned to her with a hand on the low of her back, as if moving a fallen curtain into place. "If they expected you to be small," he said, "make sure you are not what they rehearsed." She smiled then, that close, private smile that meant more than anything she could say aloud. "I won't be their script," she said. "I will be mine." He watched her as if he was taking that sentence into a ledger. "I will be with you," he said, "in whatever way you need." Quietly, loudly, however. She thought of the babies stirring inside her, of how 2 small lives had already refused the narrative Michael had tried to assign her. She thought of Imani's stubborn stew and of Dr. Patel's careful hands. She thought, too, of the old scar a little boy had given her once when she fell from a tree, how it had healed into a story about resilience. Tonight, she chose to collect those stories like talismans. The night she left for the wedding, she wore a dress that felt like a second skin, simple, with a cut that respected the shape of the life forming underneath. It was not an ostentatious gown. It did not demand the room. Rather, it acknowledged each person who looked at it, that there was something steady and unquestionable about the woman inside. Her braids were woven tight, a line of history written at the back of her head. Imani pressed a hand to her cheek in the doorway and spoke 3 words that landed like a benediction. "Go get seen." The car that took her there was not a parade of it was a quiet arrival, arranged with an understanding of the dangers of spectacle. Deng insisted on a small entourage for safety, men who watched the street, with the polite attentiveness of people who were used to moving through attention. They stood back from the velvet rope as she stepped out. Their presence made a line in the air, a small signal that her arrival had been considered, calculated with the precision of someone who understood both risk and care. The hotel where Michael and Victoria were to be married under chandeliers, and the scatter of champagne smelled of lemon oil and polished brass. The lobby swirled with guests in gowns and tuxedos, their laughter tinkling like glass. The Rolls-Royce that had pulled up to take her from the curb was matte black, not the chrome of showmanship, and as she stepped onto the carpet the room shifted. Conversations dipped into silence, then curiosity. People turned as if drawn by a magnet. She felt a small surge of momentary perversity. How strange that one small entry could rearrange a room's attention. Cameras, some for hire and some with eager phones, began to tilt toward her. She felt the weight of their faces for a moment like a physical thing, then she shifted her posture away from their hunger. She was not there to feed spectacle. She was there to be present, to name herself in the world anew. Across the room, Michael laughed with the kind of exuberance that was practiced at social functions. He had a tux that fit him like armor. Victoria, in her dress of spun glass and pearls, held his arm with a confidence that came from being the center of a plan. The pair seemed cut from a magazine spread, stone-white smiles and a sense of effortless triumph. No one in that snapshot of a moment seemed to see the past the way Zainab did. To them, story was what took place within the framed walls of that evening. Deng stood a few paces behind her, a shadow in the lamplight. He did not move to cut the room in half with his presence. He did not shout or challenge. He watched, and his face held an expression that said, more than any flourish could, that he would act if necessary, but did not seek to His hands were bare and steady. Imani squeezed Zainab's hand. "Ready?" she whispered. Zainab nodded. She smoothed the fabric across her stomach with a tenderness that felt ceremonial. In this moment she felt like an archer pulling back a bow, every part of her aware that the release would send an arrow somewhere. Not to harm, but to mark, trace a line in the air that would not be denied. If your team's A, drop a commentile, read them. The host's voice, that low, slightly sassy channel tone, sat in the corner of her thought like a wink. There was a quiet thrill in knowing that the story was not only lived. It would be seen, retold, and analyzed. The thought of strangers taking her edges and making them into headlines was both terrifying and oddly liberating. She stepped forward into the ballroom, and the room performed its small rituals of attention. A tilt of heads, the whisper of silk, the clink of glass. She felt eyes cataloging her like specimens. The dress, the braid, the shape at her middle. Some faces registered surprise, others studied, trying to decode what they saw. Michael's eyes found her across the room, and, for an instant, something in his expression faltered. The practiced grin showed a fissure of confusion. Her presence had breached the neat architecture of his script. As she walked, scenes unfurled around her in fragments. A child on a parent's hip, an elderly woman with a corsage, a man taking one more cigarette in the hotel garden. Music threaded its way through the room, a soft, matrimonial string quartet that had been rehearsed to be emotionally reliable. Guests assumed the evening would continue along its tidy trajectory. Vows, applause, a gentle ripple of congratulations. They did not yet know that the evening had shifted. At the edge of the dais, Victoria adjusted her veil with a calm that did not conceal the faint tremor in her jaw. The ceremony was about to begin. The photographer positioned, the officiant checked his notes. The room exhaled in synchronous expectation. The sequence had been practiced to give closure and celebration. For all the architecture around it, a single line of the past had entered the space. Two lives forming quietly, where someone had proclaimed her absence. The moment before the first chord of music hit, before the officiant cleared his throat and the room dissolved into formalized stillness, Zainab felt a small, private victory. It was not a shout. It was a steady, glowing ember, proof that something fundamental had changed. She stood there among crystal and polished shoes, with the city light catching the earrings at her neck like tiny moons, and thought of the two heartbeats inside her. Those were the facts no velvet rope could contain. The ceremony began. softly at first, then the hush that happens when a room holds its breath for new promises. The first vows were said in practiced lines. A few people cried at the right moments. Michael spoke with the confident cadence of a man who believed in his script. The officiant, with his small, professional solemnity, asked the time-worn question every room expects. If anyone objects. Silence pooled like a held note. Michael's smile was safe in its design. He had given his version of the past to every relevant confidant. He had expected, perhaps, that the night would make that version permanent. What none of them could predict, and what would later spread through social feeds and private group chats like Quicksilver, was the way a single presence could change the logic of an evening. The sequence had been a designed thing. People assumed that design made it immune to disruption. The next moments would reveal the vulnerability of those assumptions. She had come to be seen on her own terms, and the room saw used to rehearse narratives was about to confront the one she had quietly decided to live. She did not speak yet. She let the music finish its first phrase. She let the candles on the candelabras burn a slow, sacred light. She held the fact of the two heartbeats like a private map, and in that stillness felt the balance tip towards something she had not allowed herself to want before. Not revenge, but a restitution of truth. The quartet drew the next phrase out like a held breath, and the officiant's voice threaded through the hush with practiced softness. If anyone objects, a woman near the front, floral clutch trembling, stood. It was Victoria. She had the composure of someone who'd rehearsed her entrance a dozen times. She also had the rawness of someone startled by an unpracticed truth. Her hand found Michael's sleeve as if for balance, and, when she spoke, her voice wasn't shrill so much as astonished. "Who is that woman?" she asked. The words were more question than accusation, but the heat in the room shifted as though a window had been opened. Cameras pivoted. A hush that had hitherto been polite curiosity sharpened into attention. Michael's smile thinned. In his eyes, something like surprise flickered, then flared into an attempt at control. "Victoria," he began, but she didn't let him finish the neat sentence he'd planned for the evening. "Explain to me why she is here," Victoria said, directing the room, not toward herself, but toward the woman poised and calm in silk. "Because I was told, Michael, that you left her for a reason. I was told it was enough." The officiant's face tightened with the small panic of someone whose script had just been interrupted. Guests craned forward. Somebody's phone lit like a second sun. Zainab let the sound wash over her. In the crowd, she could see Imani's jaw set like a hinge, the way people look when they're about to hold a breath for someone else's courage. Deng remained a quiet weight behind her present, large in the room without needing to take up space. There were a few startled whispers about him. Then, silence. People don't name the things they don't want, forcing a reaction. Michael's attempt at a practiced dismissal, a joke about the coincidence of an ex at a wedding, came out brittle. "It's nothing," he said, keeping his voice even as if neutrality could fix the misalignment of attention. "An old acquaintance?" Victoria shook her head, as if tiring of a lie. "She isn't an acquaintance, Michael. She's the woman you divorced." "You told her something public and cruel," she said, the syllables precise. "You told people she couldn't give you children, and then you asked her to be at your wedding. Did you think she'd come to applaud you for being right?" A ripple of awkward laughter tried to reassert the evening's architecture. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the couple, measuring which story they'd been invited into. The air smelled suddenly of perspiration at brows and cheap perfume. For a sliver of a moment, Michael's solidity trembled. Zainab stepped forward into that small openness. She had rehearsed phrases. None of them had felt honest when she tried them on like borrowed clothes. She didn't want to embarrass anyone. She wanted to mark a fact. Her voice was steady because she had had years to prepare to be calm. Michael said, "I was Barren," she said, simply. The sentence landed without flourish, and yet it carried the heavy acoustic of every quiet table they'd ever shared. Guests sucked in a breath as if the room had suddenly become a different species of light. He tried to interrupt. "Zay." "Call me Zainab," she corrected, and there was no venom in it, only a correction that restored her name to the right place. "Then he said that in our kitchen, Once, and it changed how I walked through the world for a long time. No gasps, only faces leaning in. Some sympathetic, some impatient, for the original script to resume. The officiant glanced, fidgeting with his notes, as if he were a man at a play who'd forgotten his entrance. I went to a clinic, Zainab continued. I did every test. The doctor told me I'm fertile, she said, and I quote, that infertility can be from many causes and sometimes it is the male partner. She didn't say which was true in our marriage only, that the tests did not show I'm lacking. Her words were not a spectacle. They were a set of small facts dropped with the grace of someone who didn't need to dramatize to be heard. Cameras hunched forward. 100 little lenses, hungry for the first clear line. Michael's face had drained of color. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Earlier rehearsals of charm didn't reach the place inside his chest where uncertainty lived now, a small, unpracticed thing. He had spoken a sentence once, as if it could make a story for others. Now that sentence had been chipped away by quiet truth. Victoria's eyes filled not with triumph, but with shock at the reality that had been kept from her. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, and the question hung in the air like a small, unignorable accusation. Michael began, then looked at the crowd as if they might supply him with the right answer. The panic that comes before truth is a small animal. It rustled across his face. This was when the room felt the shape of Dang. He didn't step into the center like some movie protector, no gesture meant to frighten. He merely shifted a fraction closer, the sinew of his shoulders tightening with an alertness that suggested he would not allow things to escalate beyond a point he controlled. There was a noise in the crowd then, a soft, human recognition. People sensed danger in degrees and responded with small involuntary narrowing of their own posture. Zainab watched Michael for evidence of contrition. She found instead a man trying to assemble his way back to a story he'd told himself would hold. She could imagine the arithmetic in his head. Marriages measured, expectations assessed. She could imagine his panic that the tidy narrative he'd built that his choices were rational, justified would unravel if the real facts were allowed to breathe. I did not come to make trouble, Zainab said, voice even. I came because I have a life that is becoming visible. I have 2 heartbeats inside me. I am carrying twins. A murmur, like wind, through thin sheets. People glanced at each other, first at her dress, then at her belly, then back to her face to see if she was serious. 2 heartbeats. The specificity cut any air of ambiguity. The room found, for a moment, a common language of astonishment. You should be happy for us, Victoria said now, in a voice that sounded pleading more than possessive. I could have been happy. Then be happy now, Zainab said. And there was neither spite nor softness, only an invitation to recognize fact. Be happy that this woman in front of you is not the thing someone labeled her. Be happy that life is making itself known. Michael's jaw worked. He sought the small acrobatics he's used to when conversations go off-script: charm, denial, distraction. None of it fit the private shame he'd cultivated. Victoria's face had gone. In one corner a woman dabbed at her eyes as if to check they were still hers to cry with. In another, a man laughed morbidly to himself. The cameras that had been idly waiting pivoted for the shot of the night, the almost bride staring at an ex-wife who had refused the cage they'd built for her. Social reality condensed into an image: that night: polished shoes, a silk dress, a pregnant belly that gleamed like a defiant counterpoint to the staged joy on the dais. Someone's phone recorded the whole exchange. Another live stream went live with a whispering caption: X appears at wedding. It was a strange currency to be witnessed by 1,000 strangers in a room, and by thousands more who would watch later online. Zainab felt the oddness of that modern intimacy, the way one's life could be translated into 1,000 reactions in minutes. She stood steady, because steadiness, she knew, makes an impression stronger than any dramatic flourish. Victoria broke then, not at Zainab, but at Michael. You lied about her body, she said. You used that to make peace with your choices. You moved on under that story, and you asked me to be a part of it without telling me the truth. There was an edge to the accusation that made it harder for Michael to respond with his practiced ease. To be exposed for lying about the very thing someone had built a life on is a different species of humiliation than a public argument. It asks questions about how well you know yourself and the people you purport to love. Michael finally spoke, voice small and brittle. I thought. He couldn't finish. When you build your decisions on a sentence that hurts someone, you don't always have a ready defense when that sentence is shown false. Zainab didn't need to say anything else. The 2 hot beats had already been her most honest argument. To the crowd, she presented the fact of life literal, undeniable, and let it do the work she had once imagined revenge would do. There was a long, awkward beat. Glasses were set down with more force than necessary. Someone at the back muttered. And that mutter became the first link in the chain of the viral moment. A hand lifted a phone. The live feed caught a line of the exchange, and within minutes the clip would be mutating into headlines. What will you do? A reporter's voice asked from the threshold, unaware of the etiquette that once protected private moments from tabloids. In a world that thrives on spectacle, privacy is a shrinking commodity. De Jong's presence steadied as if to protect a fragile voice. He did not speak, not because he lacked words, but because his restraint had weight. When he finally did, it was to the room, not to Michael. His voice was low, controlled, with a syllabic economy that made listeners lean in to collect each sound. Whatever the past held, he said, it cannot decide this child's right to be held in peace. The few who knew the half-sentences about the world he navigated felt a small intake of air. There was power in the gentle way he placed protection before spectacle. It read as quiet warning and as an attempt to avoid escalation. A cousin of Michael's, a well-meaning man trying to smooth the evening tension, made a half-joke that landed flat. A woman near the cake whispered, "Well, that's awkward," as if that should absolve anyone of the unease. Social rituals have a way of wanting to smooth away the rawness of truth. Michael's retreat was not dramatic. He didn't storm out. He became small. He became the brittle center of a social collapse that makes the polite take sides. Victoria took his arm then, the gesture of a woman trying to salvage what could be salvaged. She didn't look fully like a bride. She looked like someone who had bought a fairy tale and discovered a hole in the binding. When the ceremony ended because the officiant, awkward and wanting out, declared the formalities complete, people dispersed in little knots. Some to consoles of camaraderie, some to phones to stitch the footage into narratives, some to coffee machines to try and make meaning of the unwieldy fact that the carefully constructed evening had been interrupted by a living, beating contradiction. Zainab left before the cake was cut. She had planned the exit the way you plan a small ritual. It would be hushed, dignified, not a flight in scandalous heels, but an act of closure. Deng walked with her through the lobby where the chandeliers shimmered. Above a carpet stamped with a pattern meant to impress wedding guests into remembering the night for pleasant reasons. Security, those quiet men who had kept a respectful distance, opened a discreet path. Outside, the city breathed like a different skin. The car that had brought her was waiting under the muted glow of the hotel awning. Flashbulbs pricked from the sidewalk where the inevitable circle of viewers had gathered. The live feed would carry edited clips within minutes. Those with the best commentary would shape the story's earliest narrative. In the back of the car, Imani's hand found hers. "You did it," she whispered, and it sounded less like triumph and more like a benediction approval of a woman who had reclaimed a part of herself. The clip went viral. Within hours, it was everywhere. A brief sequence that neatly framed the modern spectacle humiliation attempted, dignity returned. Some wrote sympathetic posts praising Zainab's courage. Others debated whether going to the wedding was provocative. Opinion pieces proliferated with the mechanical speed of outrage and empathy. Hashtags trended in the way small, furious storms trend across the internet. The hotel issued a perfunctory statement about respecting privacy and refraining from commenting on personal matters. A few gossip columns tried to reconstruct timelines and motives with the elaborate cruelty of people who profit from other people's pain. Michael's inbox filled in ways he had never engineered. Business partners sent terse, fatherly emails. A few clients requested to reschedule meetings. An investor made a quiet, distancing statement that rippled through the company. He felt the social consequences of having misrepresented the past in order to have a present he liked. There were no dramatic arrests, no cinematic downfall, just the slow unspooling of credibility and the strange loneliness that comes when people doubt the narrative you've used to justify yourself. Victoria retreated from the public spectacle in a way that read as exhaustion more than shame. She withdrew her posts, unfriended a few mutants, and a week later announced that the wedding would be postponed, an act that read less like contrition and more like a need for time. People took sides with surprising ferocity on social media, as if every public humiliation is a spectator sport that must be graded. For Zainab, the viral moment had an odd double life. It magnified the reality she'd lived through, how small decisions had multiplied into a story, and it also exposed her family to a dizzying outside world. Strangers messaged, with kindness and cruelty in equal measure. Her gallery's phone lit up with congratulatory notes from artists who admired how she had chosen to show up. Dr. Patel's number pinged with a patient who'd seen the clip and felt less alone. The raw material of her life braids, stew. Small rituals of care became captionable moments that strangers wanted to tuck into their feeds. There was an aftershock of quieter consequences that mattered more to her. Her relationship with Michael was now catalogued as a case study of quiet cruelty. Her friends rallied around to the extent friendships can. The pregnancy continued, tethered to appointments and routine and joy. Deng negotiated the world with the patient, practical intelligence she'd come to rely on. Finding a pediatrician who understood the crossroads of cultures, ensuring privacy for scans, speaking softly to nurses in a way that made them feel respected rather than controlled. He never turned their life into sensational material. He treated the baby's impending arrival with a thrift of attention, careful, measured, sincere. Months later, in the anonymity of a private birthing suite, she held two small, furious beings who announced themselves with the rawness of new life. They came into the world, loud and immediate. The nurse laid them on her chest, and their tiny fists closed like a promise. Zainab wept not only with the relief of birth, but with the incoherent gratitude of a woman who had been told she would not belong to the story of motherhood and now held the evidence to the contrary in her arms. They named them Kian and Kians that spoke to a softness she wanted them to inherit. Deng stood midway between guarded and unashamed, fingers splayed on the countertop, watching the small miracles of color and breath. Imani held a shawl to her shoulder and laughed into her soup-sweet tears. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweetness of baby skin. Outside, the city's lights were a patient, steady presence, as if the world had patted itself down to give them room. Paternity, in the way people discuss it online, was a non-issue for Zainab. She had always wanted clarity when it mattered. She had received it from the clinic months before. The babies were loved into being, and the question of who was to be credited with their sperm and breath mattered less than the fact that they were safely within her arms and protected. Deng signed forms with a steadiness that showed he intended to shoulder responsibilities. He did not make a spectacle of it. He showed up, and that presence mattered in a way the gossip columns could not parse. When the feeds had cooled, life reacquired an ordinary rhythm. The gallery mounted an exhibit that Samaran installation Zainab curated about rebirths, photographs of neighborhoods at dawn, sculptures made from old umbrellas, paintings that caught the exact color of late lights. Critics responded kindly. The show sold enough to keep the gallery afloat and to give artists the chance to keep working. Zainab walked the opening with a small stroller tucked behind her like an annex of love. Mothers in the crowd nodded in recognition, as they recognized the complicated joy of keeping small beings fed and loved. Deng proposed in a manner that matched the man she had come to trust. It was not in a palace or a parade. It was a quiet afternoon in the studio. V had chosen a simple patch of sunlight on the floor, where the children's toys gathered like an improvised city. He knelt with a ring that was modest in design and said a few words that felt like ledger entries for the soul. He did not speak of past power. He spoke of present promises, to keep a home that is safe, to teach their children two languages so they could speak to both halves of their lives, to respect boundaries. Zainab said yes, because she wanted to, because the proposal was an honest ledger of affection and responsibility, not a transaction. Their wedding some years later was intimate. There were no chandeliers of the sort that had once demanded attention. There were instead rugs they liked, a small altar draped with fabric from both their cultures, and a handful of friends who had stood with them through the private weather. Imani braided Zainab's hair for the ceremony that time too, as if the braid itself was a thread connecting all the small rituals that kept them steady. The children wore tiny suits and a simple dress, and announced themselves with the candid audacity that only toddlers have. People who had watched the viral clip years before came up to Zainab to say, quietly, that they had been wrong to judge without knowing the facts. She accepted those apologies without gloating. They were oil on a bruise. Professionally, Zainab found a new axis of strength. She built exhibits that put marginalized voices forward and used her platform to uplift artists who explored themes of resilience and identity. She taught classes at the gallery for young artists, new to the city, immigrants and children of immigrants who needed someone who knew the shape of the entrance to the art world. She liked guiding them through the process of hanging work in a room so that every frame had a place to breathe. The old penthouse faded from the edges of her life like a painting you'd moved to a different wall. Still there, but not occupying the center of the living room. Michael's life moved on too, less ceremonially and more quietly, with the consequences of a man whose choices had public ripple. There was a brief period where people asked him about the viral clip in interviews, and he fumbled an explanation. He didn't become a pariah. People don't transform overnight. But he found some doors that had once opened for him, now moved more slowly. A few clients chose others. It was a consequence that was more social than legal, an echo of a life revealed. Years after the wedding, there was a small plaque in the gallery's back room, a private dedication to the curators who had come before with small, insurgent works. On the base someone had carved a single sentence in aphorism Zainab had never meant to make famous. They called me Barren, but I grew an orchard. The line was not posted on social media. It hung on a wall where staff could read it between cups of coffee and the small battles of running a gallery. It reminded her of how language could be a weapon or a seed. There were ordinary, luminous afternoons where the family would gather in their small backyard when the city allowed sunlight to pool like spilled coin. Deng would push one of the twins on a swing while Zainab trimmed the herb patch. Kian and Kai chased each other in the grass and made small, urgent demands that rendered adult concerns temporarily trivial. Once, as they watched the children grapple with a stubborn branch, Deng tucked his hand into hers and said, "You did this." He meant not just the children, but the life, this messy, sometimes unpredictable, deeply loved life. She looked at him then, at the man who had been an ambiguous shelter and who had chosen tenderness over spectacle, and she found the words easy. "We did it," she said. "We made this." And later, after the twins learned to talk, and before another child they called Zara arrived as an unexpected, luminous addition to their family, Zainab would often catch herself thinking back to the kitchen island, to the silk scarf, to the sentence that once tried to shrink her. The memory no longer had the same power. It had been a map of a wound she'd learned to read differently. Wounds can teach where maps once failed. She taught her children to say both their names and the names of their grandmothers and to understand that family is often stitched from different fabrics. At night, when the house quieted and the city hummed like an engine at rest, she would move through rooms lit by small lamps and think of the way small acts of courage compound, a test taken, a decision to leave, the insistence on reclaiming one's name. The epilogue of her life wasn't a grand, public vindication, so much as a patient ordering of matters. She became less interested in proving people wrong and more interested in proving to herself the truth she wanted her life to embody. That dignity does not require spectacle. That truth, when held steady, has the power to rearrange even the most polished narratives. If the online world remembered the wedding as the night a woman appended a script in their living rooms, it became the night two children entered the world and made everything else old slights. Curated marriages, petty social scripts less important. On an afternoon many years after the clip, the family walked the gallery's newest exhibit, works that spoke of shelter and belonging. Kian and Kai pointed at a sculpture, then at a painting of a city at dawn, then at a photograph of a woman's hands braiding hair. A plaque nearby read, simply, "Roots are not always where the soil begins." Zainab read it and smiled. Deng, watching her, reached for her hand. They had not arrived at a place without complexity. Diang's past in that gray world was still part of who he was, and they navigated its edges with care. But love, they'd learned, had many loyalties. To compassion, to protection, to the quiet labor of making a home. They kept those loyalties as carefully as they kept their children's hyphenated names. At night, sometimes, when the twins were asleep and Zara hummed under a blanket, Zanab would press her hand to the small swell of the old memory and transform it into something benign, an old bruise that had taught her how to tend a garden. "They called me Barren," she would say quietly into the dark, not to anyone in particular, "but I grew an orchard." If this story landed with you, if it reminded you that names matter and that dignity can be rebuilt, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you want more stories like this, like and subscribe.